You know, right now, India and China are currently holding these joint anti-terrorism dialogues in Central Asia,
Yeah.
but literally on the exact same day, about like 4,000 miles away in Geneva, India is actively trying to legally sabotage China's global tech ambitions.
Right. It's a crazy contrast.
I mean, how can two nations be military partners in one room and then basically act as economic assassins in another?
It really sounds like a geopolitical glitch, doesn't it? But it's actually the defining paradox of the 21st century. We tend to cling to this outdated idea that foreign policy happens in these neat little silos.
Right, like totally separate boxes.
Exactly. You have the defense ministers dealing with troops and borders in one silo, and then trade ministers dealing with tariffs and subsidies in another. But the reality on the ground is just far more fluid.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because when you look at the source material we have from 2026, you see this collision happening in real time.
You really do.
We have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, their defense ministers meeting happening in Bishkek. And simultaneously, we have India taking this fiercely oppositional stance at the World Trade Organization over new China-backed global trade rules. So our mission for this deep dive is to figure out India's balancing act here.
And, what's crucial for you listening to understand is that this isn't just about diplomatic handshakes. It's about the very real cause and effect chains linking geopolitics, national security, and the domestic economy. On the surface, a military summit in Kyrgyzstan and a trade dispute in Switzerland share zero DNA.
Yeah, they seem completely unrelated.
Right, but pull back the lens and you realize they're both battlegrounds in the exact same war for strategic autonomy. India is navigating a world where a tariff can be just as devastating as a tank,
Wow, yeah.
and where supply chain vulnerability is basically a glaring national security threat.
Okay, let's look at the Bishkek meeting first, because the optics of this are just wild. The official agenda for this SCO defense ministers meeting was enhancing military cooperation.
Right.
We're talking about expanding joint military exercises, increasing training exchanges, and building better coordination among the armed forces of the member states.
And the centerpiece of all that cooperation is this framework known as RAT.
Right, the regional anti-terrorist structure.
Exactly. The member states gathered in Bishkek to renew this collective commitment to dismantle terror safe havens. RATS essentially functions as an institutional mechanism for intelligence sharing. The strategic logic is that by forcing these militaries to interact regularly and, share data on extremist movements, you build confidence and reduce regional mistrust.
But, I mean, we have to point out the glaring structural contradiction here.
Oh, absolutely.
India and Pakistan are both full members of the SCO, so they are sitting at this exact same table drafting joint statements about dismantling terror infrastructure. It's like forming a neighborhood watch committee to stop local vandalism, while everyone is painfully aware that one of the committee members is the person going around smashing all the streetlights.
That is a perfect analogy. And the tension there was palpable. India's defense minister, Rajnath Singh, he leaned directly into it.
He didn't hold back at all.
No, he delivered a really blunt call for a zero-tolerance approach to terrorism, but he specifically highlighted state-sponsored threats. He made it very clear that terror infrastructure cannot be granted impunity under the guise of regional differences.
So he used a multilateral platform to indirectly but unmistakably call out a fellow member state.
Yes. What's fascinating here is how this highlights the whole dynamic of multipolarity. I mean, the SCO survives not because its members are best friends,
Definitely not.
but because it is a necessary form for managing rivalries. India knows the SCO is heavily influenced by China and Russia, right? But boycotting it would mean ceding the Eurasian strategic space entirely to Beijing.
And they can't afford to do that.
Exactly. By showing up, India ensures its security concerns, particularly regarding cross-border terrorism, remain on the official record. And crucially, it allows for sideline diplomacy.
Right, such as the bilateral talks India and China held right there in Bishkek, ostensibly focusing on regional security. I mean, they are engaging diplomatically to manage border tensions while simultaneously viewing each other as primary strategic competitors.
And the nature of that competition is shifting, which became obvious when you look at the rest of the Bishkek agenda. The defense ministers spent a significant amount of time discussing the conflict in West Asia.
Because in a hyper-connected world, a localized conflict thousands of miles away is a direct threat to domestic stability.
Think about the geography. West Asia is the energy artery for much of the world, including ESCO members and BRICS nations like India and China.
Right.
If maritime security in those corridors breaks down, or if a localized war disrupts oil and gas shipments, the domestic impact is immediate. You see energy prices spike, inflation surges, manufacturing slows down.
And suddenly a foreign military conflict becomes a domestic economic crisis.
Precisely. And the concept of minor part India's push for self-reliance is deeply, deeply tied to mitigating these exact external shocks. They need energy security to maintain strategic autonomy.
So that expanding definition of security really crystallized when the ministers started deliberating on non-traditional threats. Things like transnational crime, information warfare, and cybersecurity.
Yeah, that's where the real modern battlefield is.
So let me ask you, the listener, to actively connect the dots here. Think about it. How does a cyber threat transition into an economic one?
Well, when you realize that a state-sponsored malware attack on a power grid can cripple a city's economy faster than a missile strike, you start to see why India's defense strategy doesn't stop at the SEO. A cyber intrusion that, say, steals intellectual property from a burgeoning electric vehicle manufacturer in Pune,
Right.
that isn't just an IT problem. It is a calculated strike against India's industrial future. Modern warfare has totally weaponized the global economy.
Which bleeds directly into the trade rules they are fighting over in Geneva. I mean, the transition from the security dialogue in Bishkek to the economic standoff at the WTO is seamless.
It really is.
Because at the WTO, India is facing down a series of negotiations, many heavily backed by China, aimed at tightening the rules on industrial subsidies, state support, and e-commerce.
And India is taking immense heat for its stance here. I mean, they are risking massive diplomatic isolation by refusing to sign on to these new frameworks.
Okay, but I need to push back on India's stance here for a second, because if you read the headlines, modernizing trade governance sounds like an inherently positive thing, right? We want a cleaner, more transparent global trading system.
Sure, on paper.
So isn't protecting this quote-unquote policy space just a polite phrase for protectionism? If India keeps subsidizing outdated industries or shielding uncompetitive local tech startups from global competition, aren't they ultimately hurting their own consumers with higher prices and worse products?
That is the classic textbook neoliberal argument, right?
Yeah.
But it completely ignores the historical reality of how nations actually industrialize.
How so?
Well, every advanced economy today, the US, the UK, Germany, and even China, they built their foundational industrial strength behind a massive wall of tariffs and state subsidies. They used aggressive government intervention to nurture their domestic industries until those industries were strong enough to compete globally.
Ah, so it's like kicking away the ladder once you've already climbed it.
Exactly. It's a very familiar concept in geoeconomics. Let's look at the mechanics of how it operates today. The proposals at the WTO aim to severely restrict industrial subsidies in the name of creating a level playing field. But the field is already violently tilted.
Because of China.
Right. China spent the last 3 decades heavily subsidizing its manufacturing base to the point of absolute global dominance. If the WTO bans industrial subsidies tomorrow, China's existing mega factories just keep churning out cheap goods while developing nations are legally barred from funding their own competing factories.
Okay, let's unpack how that cause and effect chain plays out locally with something like India's PLI schemes, the production-linked incentives.
The PLI scheme is a perfect example of the policy space India is fighting to protect. Let's say India wants to build a domestic smartphone manufacturing industry from scratch.
Right.
The upfront costs of building factories, training a workforce, and setting up supply chains in a developing nation are incredibly high. Without help, a local company cannot possibly price their phones cheaper than an established Chinese mega factory.
So the Indian government steps in and offers a PLI. For every smartphone the local company manufactures and sells, the government gives them a direct cash rebate, say 5% of the sale value.
Exactly. That direct financial support offsets the initial disadvantages. It allows the local company to survive, scale up, hire thousands of workers, and eventually bring their costs down to a globally competitive level. But the new WTO rules being proposed would classify those exact PLI schemes as illegal, market-distorting subsidies.
So by pushing for these rules, advanced economies and China are essentially trying to freeze the current global hierarchy right in place. If you don't already have a massive industrial base, you are just out of luck.
And that is exactly why India views these WTO negotiations through a lens of national security, not just economics. Allowing Beijing to dictate the normative rules of global commerce would give them permanent leverage over supply chains.
Yeah, that makes sense.
India is fighting to ensure it doesn't swap its historical reliance on Western imports for a future reliance on Chinese technology and manufacturing.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because this brings up a critical institutional workaround that advanced economies are using to bypass India's veto power. The source text dives into the battle over plurilateral initiatives.
Right, the plurilaterals. So the WTO is built on a multilateral framework, meaning decisions require absolute consensus. Every single member state, big or small, has to agree. As you can imagine, getting over 160 countries to agree on complex trade rules is nearly impossible.
So, out of frustration, a subset of wealthy nations basically decides to form a club within the club.
Exactly. They launch a plurilateral initiative. 30 or 40 advanced economies get together, agree on a stringent new set of rules regarding, say, digital trade or green subsidies, and they just implement it among themselves.
But wait, how does that threaten a country like India if they just refuse to join the
It
club?
was of market access. Once these 30 powerful nations adopt the rule, they begin demanding that any external country wishing to trade with them must also comply with those new standards. It is a backdoor mechanism to force developing nations to adhere to rules they never had a voice in drafting.
Wow.
India objects to plurilaterals, not just to be difficult, but because they fundamentally erode the inclusive, consensus-based foundation of the WTO.
It's a blatant marginalization tactic.
Yes, it is.
But the fight isn't just over future manufacturing. India is literally digging its heels in over basic survival. Let's talk about food security, because the standoff over PSH public stockholding is perhaps the most contentious issue on the entire table.
It's massive. So under the WTO's Agreement on Agriculture, there are strict limits on how much a government can financially support its farmers. The cap is generally set at 10% of the total value of agricultural production.
Which, that sounds reasonable on paper. 10% is a significant buffer.
It would be reasonable, except for the bizarre mathematical formula the WTO uses to calculate that limit. The reference prices used to determine the value of that agricultural production are permanently pegged to prices from the years 1986 to 1988.
Wait, really? That is staggering?
Yeah.
The WTO is calculating a country's allowable food subsidy budget based on what a sack of rice cost almost 40 years ago.
It's absurd.
Man.
Imagine being told you have to feed your family today, but your grocery budget is strictly capped at what you would have spent in 1987. It practically guarantees you will exceed the limit immediately. And India procures massive amounts of food grains from its farmers at a minimum support price, or MSP. This massive public stockholding system serves a dual purpose. It guarantees a livelihood for millions of impoverished farmers, and it creates a strategic grain reserve to distribute subsidized food to hundreds of millions of low-income citizens.
And because of inflation and the realities of modern agriculture, India's MSP payouts frequently breach that outdated 1986 limit, putting them right in the crosshairs of WTO disputes.
Exactly. Advanced agricultural exporters, heavily represented by the West, argue that India's massive stockholding distorts global food prices. They want stricter limits. But for India, this is an absolute, non-negotiable red line.
You can't just give up on that.
No, you cannot compromise on domestic food security and risk famine or massive rural unrest just to satisfy some archaic international trade formula. India is demanding a permanent solution to the public stockholding issue, like an update to those reference prices, before they will even entertain broader discussions on agricultural modernization.
So we have the physical realm covered, protecting manufacturing supply chains through PLIs, and defending food security through public stockholding. Let's do a quick revision recap of the cause and effect here.
Sure.
The root cause is these outdated trade rules and asymmetric rulemaking. The effect is India blocking consensus at the WTO to protect its domestic base.
Exactly.
But the source material also points to a massive, invisible war happening over the digital realm. Data is the new oil, and India is guarding its wells fiercely.
Digital sovereignty is arguably the most critical frontier for strategic autonomy over the next 50 years. The WTO is currently hosting these intense plurilateral negotiations aimed at liberalizing e-commerce and ensuring the free, unrestricted flow of data across borders.
Again, free flow of data sounds like a wonderful open internet ideal. Why is India so wary of signing these binding commitments?
Look at who is pushing for those commitments. It is overwhelmingly the home countries of massive trillion-dollar tech monopolies. If a developing nation agrees to unrestricted cross-border data flows today, they are essentially handing over their citizens' data to Western and Chinese megacorporations for free.
And those companies absorb the data, process it, use it to train incredibly powerful AI algorithms, and then sell the resulting services back to the developing nation at a massive premium.
Right, it is literally a form of digital colonialism. If India signs binding commitments at the WTO now, they permanently surrender their right to mandate data localization.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, data localization is the requirement that foreign companies store Indian data on physical servers located within India's borders,
Exact.
which gives the Indian government legal jurisdiction over that data.
It gives them jurisdiction, regulatory oversight, and crucially, the ability to tax those digital activities. India has a massive, rapidly digitizing population. It is nurturing its own domestic tech ecosystem. If they throw the doors open prematurely, local startups will just be crushed by foreign monopolies wielding algorithmic supremacy.
So they're buying time.
Yes, India is buying time. They are keeping their policy space open until their domestic framework is robust enough to compete globally.
It's the exact same logic as the manufacturing subsidies. Protects the nascent industry until it can stand on its own.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this brings us to the domestic political economy, which is the invisible anchor holding all these geopolitical strategies in place. A trade negotiator in Geneva isn't just operating in a vacuum. They are acutely aware of the political constituencies back home.
Right. Millions of farmers rely on the minimum support price to survive. Thousands of small business owners are hoping to benefit from PLI manufacturing schemes. A burgeoning class of tech entrepreneurs needs protection from global monopolies to scale their startups.
Any perception that the government in New Delhi is trading away safeguards for these massive, highly organized voting blocs would trigger immense domestic political fallout. New Delhi's strategy at the WTO is heavily dictated by the need to maintain domestic stability and economic growth. They simply cannot afford to sign an international treaty that hollows out their domestic workforce.
When you pull back and look at the whole board, India's strategy is actually incredibly cohesive. They're utilizing a strategy of what we might call weaponized gradualism.
Oh, I like that framing. Elaborate on that.
Well, we often view a refusal to sign treaties or a reluctance to integrate as a passive defensive move. But in the 21st century, moving slowly is an aggressive geopolitical strategy. By dragging their feet on WTO modernization, by blocking plurilateral agreements, and by engaging at the SCO only on their own specific terms regarding terrorism, India is basically weaponizing time.
They really are. They're using the friction of international bureaucracy to stall the ambitions of rival powers while they aggressively build up their own internal capacities. They take the short-term reputational hit of being labeled an obstructionist to secure long-term strategic autonomy.
Exactly. They are buying the decades they need for Atmanirbhar Bharat to actually materialize into a globally competitive manufacturing and digital base.
It's a masterclass in balancing. Think about it. India utilizes frameworks like RA-TES to address immediate security concerns like state-sponsored terrorism. They manage their borders through sideline diplomacy at the SCO with China. But simultaneously, they operate as a formidable roadblock at the WTO to prevent the institutionalization of an economic order that favors Beijing or the West at the expense of the developing world.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? It fundamentally reshapes how we should consume the news.
It really does.
The next time you read a headline about a boring tariff dispute or a stalled negotiation over agricultural subsidies, realize that you aren't just reading about economics, you are reading about national security.
The battle lines have completely shifted. A nation's sovereignty is no longer just determined by its military hardware or its border patrols. It is determined by its control over its supply chains, its data infrastructure, and its ability to feed its own population without relying on the goodwill of the global market.
Which leaves us with a massive looming question, something for you to carry with you as you watch these geopolitical events unfold. As the lines between national security and economic policy continue to blur entirely, as cyber attacks become economic weapons, and trade rules become tools of geopolitical coercion, what happens to these siloed institutions?
That is the million-dollar question. Will the WTO and the SCO buckle under the sheer weight of these competing, intertwining national interests? Or will we see the emergence of entirely new, hybrid geoeconomic institutions designed for a multipolar world where trade and security are formally recognized as the exact same thing?
It is definitely the defining question of the next decade. Keep questioning the forces shaping the rules we all have to live by. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.